Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Laseniziris, and this is my YouTube channel, GrecoChess. In this video, we continue the coverage of the tournament take place at the Queens Chess Club in Floral Park, New York. This video is about the game I played in round 3. First, some news about the tournament. This is from the webpage of the Queens Chess Club. It takes place on 5 consecutive Fridays. Round 1 was September 5th. Round 2 was September 12th. I showed these games in previous videos. Now I'm showing my game from round 3 took place September 19th. Yesterday night, September 26th, we had my game we had round 4, in fact, and I'm going to show my game in next video. And next week, there'll be the last round, October 3rd. 5 Swiss rounds, time control. G90 D5. What does it mean? It means that when the game starts, players have 90 minutes on their clocks. And when it's player's turn to move for the first 5 seconds, the player is thinking, the clock does not move, and then it goes downwards. And players need to complete all their moves before the clock shows 0. Otherwise, the player loses because they run out of time. About my opponent now, a few words on round 3. His name is Edgar Rosello Cimafranca. His rating is 1910, and he's in the 95.1 percentile, meaning that he's better than 95.1% of the members of the United States Chess Federation, and only 4.9% are better than him. Compare this with my numbers. My official rating was 1582, but October 1st, it's going to rise to 1609 after the 2 tournaments I played at Albany for the New York State Championship and in Jericho, Long Island for Chessanity. And I'm in the 87th percentile. What does this mean? It means that Edgar is the best. And before we start, let me remind everyone, if you haven't seen my previous videos, that I lost in round 1 and 1 in round 2. So I have 1 point out of 2. Also, about the screen that you see on the left half is a chessboard provided by chess.com. And on the right half, before the word analysis, the computer of chess.com is going to show who is ahead. Positive means that positive number means white is better, negative number that black is better. If the move played was the best, and if not, which move would have been the best, and what are the best 3 options for the player whose turn is to come. Edgar had the right pieces, I had the black. So had the white pieces, I had the black. And Edgar starts with the pawn going to d4. My pawn goes to d5 symmetric. And usually when you start with the d pawn to d4, the next move is pawn goes to c4. And I reply with a slab defense. Pawn goes to c6. Prefer over the e-pawn to give more space to my bishop on c8. Third move, knight to c3, and I develop my other knight to f6. Now Edgar sends his bishop to g5. And I'm going to pin my knight. I don't like it, but I need to give space to my bishop on f8, open the diagonal, and also exert influence over the center. So my pawn goes to e6, but my f6 knight is pinned. I'd better not touch it before the pin is resolved. Otherwise, I lose my queen from the very beginning and the game is over. Pawn to e3 for whites, and I pin my knight by placing my bishop on e7. Knight to f3 for Edgar. Short castling for me. Bishop to d3. And until now, we followed what are called book moves, meaning moves existing in the database, chess database, and have been analyzed exhaustively in the past, in the opening theory. And now I deviate from theory, but since white has already made a move with the white bishop, why not take now the pawn on c4, and white will waste a second move to recover. My knight goes to d7, develop my knight. Castling for white, short castling. And my knight goes to d5. You're going to see once again book move, and you may be surprised how come we are back in open theory. And the reason I believe is that because this position exists in opening theory, but has been reached through a different series of moves. And I do it not because I knew all these things I'm sharing with you, I found them after the fact, but because I felt I was squeezed and wanted to give more space to my pieces and perhaps some exchanges, and that's what's happening. Bishop on e7, queen on e7, we exchange the dark-colored bishops. And we completed the first 10 moves. White is ahead by 0.42, most of it because it started first, a little bit they gained after that. White places rook to c1. Why? Semi-open file. The c file is semi-open in the sense that there is only one pawn from my side, no white pawns. Ideally, rooks want open files, but no such files exist. Semi-open files is the next best choice. My knight goes to b6 to threaten the bishop at c4, and the bishop will go to d3. My bishop goes to d7, out of the opening square, and also my two rooks, a8 and f8, can communicate. White places the knight on e5. In my half of the board, I don't like it too much, and also can choose at will whether they want to exchange the bishop on d7 or not. My knight goes to f6. Why? Because white already has the bishop on the diagonal b1 h7. If they can place the queen there, then my pawn at h7 is very sensitive. It cannot have only one guard, the king, because otherwise, if queen checks on h7, it could even be a checkmate. And one better think these things ahead of time and not at the last moment. Queen goes to e2 for white, and my rook goes to d8. My rook also has a semi-open file, the d file, only a white pawn at d4. White places his second rook on the semi-open file. My bishop goes to e8. Why? First of all, white cannot choose at will whether to exchange the knight to the bishop. You want to give as little freedom to your opponent as possible. And also the bishop controls 4 out of the 8 squares where the knight can go. c6, d7, f7, g6. All the 4 squares in the front of the knight. I don't like the knight on e5, but if it's there, at least control where it can go. Bishop to b1 for white, and it's clear what they want. The queen to go to d3 and exert pressure over h7. My knight goes to d5. Why? If for any reason my knight on f6 is exchanged, then at least it will be taken back by another knight, and I'm still safe on h7. Pawn to a3 for white. Why? Because white was afraid that my knight from d5 might land in b4 and thus not allow the queen to go to c2 or d3 and be on this diagonal. And just to tell you, of course, my opponent did not know it then, that these thoughts had not crossed my mind. My rook to c8, and now all rooks of both sides are on semi-open files. One each side has on the c file and one on the d file. And white decides to start attacking the g file. Pawn goes to g4. The idea being that if they can put their queen on the b1 h7 diagonal and they push a pawn to g5, then either my knight will be lost, them down a piece, or if it moves, check on h7 and checkmate on h8. But I reply with my pawn at h6, not allowing the pawn to go to g5, because then it will be taken. White starts expanding on the h file, pawn goes to h3. My knight goes to d7, hoping to exchange the knight on e5. And white places the knight on e4. And my queen goes to h4 to attack the pawn at h3. Now that white has moved the pawns in front of the king, I want to see if I can take advantage. We completed 20 moves, and white is ahead by 0.78. They little by little increase the advantage, but still there's a lot of game to be played. White protects the pawn on h3 with the king on going to g2. If the pawn on h3 is lost, it's not just one pawn, but my pieces little by little will start entering black's half of the field and be near, white's half of the field and be near white's king. My knight goes to f8, hoping later to be able to approach the white king. Even if it goes backwards, at least it's going towards the king side. Knight to f3 for white. Attacks my queen. And I need to be careful because a queen, in theory, can go up to 27 different squares if it's at the center of the board and if the board is empty. At this current position, my queen can go to only 8 squares, and in 7 out of the 8 is going to be taken. There's only 1 square on e7, and of course I had made sure this happened before I made my previous moves. I made sure that there was a 1 square for the queen to retreat. You don't want to find it when it's too late that your queen is attacked and all squares where it can go, none of it is safe. White sends their knight to e5. And I attack the knight with my pawn to f6. And in most similar positions, this is not a good move because the knight can go to g6 as a whole and attacks a queen, and who knows, might even attack a rook and have a fork if there's a rook on f8. But in this case, because I have bishop on e8 and knight on f8, I knew that the white knight could not go to g6 and instead would have to go back, and it goes back to f3. And now that this knight is backwards, I can safely place my knight on g6 and have my knight near the black, excuse me, the white king. Queen goes to e1. And now that white has pushed the pawns in front of the king, I want to open up this place of the board, hoping for a nice attack. So my pawn goes to f5. Knight goes to g3, and now I'm exchanging the pawns at g4. And the white king may not start feeling safe. At this point, I want to continue coming near the white king. Knight goes to h4 check, and let me tell you, at this point, Edgar did not see that was a check. He moved his queen somewhere, but I had to remind him to check, so he had to take my knight. If the king moves, then I win a knight, the knight on f3. So we exchange the knights. And I'm threatening the pawn on g4. Edgar places his pawn on f3. My queen goes to g5 to be straight against the king. King goes to f2, because at this point, the pawn at e3 is attacked twice by queen and knight and defended only by the queen. So if white does nothing, I'm winning the pawn at e3. So king goes to f2, and my bishop goes to g6. I want to change with the white king, so with the white bishop, so I don't have to worry about the diagonal from b1 to h7. At this point, we completed the first 30 moves. In fact, now I am ahead by 0.17. But this is very little, a lot of game in front of us. Let's see what's going to happen. First of all, as I wanted, we exchange bishops. Queen goes to h1 for white. To provide further protection to the f3 pawn, I believe, my rook goes to f8. Queen goes to h5, and white basically proposes an exchange of queens. But since I'm in the attack, I don't want it. I want to keep queens. When you're attacking, you need to have as many pieces as possible attacking, and definitely the heavy ones. An exchange of queens would suddenly make my attack stop. That's why instead I'm putting my queen on f6, attacking the pawn on f3, and white defends it by placing the queen on h1. In this point, I want to triple queens and rooks on the f-file to have an even stronger attack. So I send my rook on c7. White wants to stop this plan, that's why he sends his knight on e4, and yes, I can still put my rook on f7, but then I lose my queen. And of course, I'm not going to lose my queen. What I'm doing is I'm placing my queen on g6 and threatening the knight on e4 because of the pin. If white does nothing, I take the knight and the pawn cannot take it back because of the queen. I'm a knight ahead. Of course, white is not going to do nothing, places the king on e2, so the pawn is not pinned any longer. I cannot take the knight. But now I can place my rook on f7. White is going to place the rook on f1 to provide better coverage to the pawn on f3. Otherwise, if I wanted, I could make an exchange, win the queen and the pawn for my two rooks, and expose white king quite a lot, although materially it's 5 plus 5, 10 is 9 plus 1 is 10, but really the king would be very much exposed without their queen. When it goes to f6, I don't like this knight on e4. If we can exchange it and put my queen, that would be wonderful. And white likes his knight, that's why he placed on d6. But it also threatens my rook on f7. So I need to do something about the rook. Rook goes to d7. Knight goes to c4. And my rook goes to d5. Try to put my rook as ahead as possible. Great moves as a computer. And knight goes to e5 and attacks my queen. And queen goes to e8. At this point, we completed the first 40 moves, and the computer says 0.00, meaning the computer thinks we both have the same chances. Position is even. It's going to be a very dramatic game, it seems, where everything might be decided on a small mistake here or there. Move 41. Queen goes to g2 for white. Mistake. And my knight goes to d7, hoping to exchange the knights. Because this knight at e5 was both troublesome, I would say, could control many squares, and in addition, even my knight would block my queen and rooks from aligning. White is not going to exchange it himself. Pawn goes to f4. And what's going to happen is I'm going to initiate exchanges. And my rook from d5 is going to b5. I'm threatening the pawn at b2, and not only that, there's a queen behind that. If white is not careful, I take the pawn with a check, and then I win the queen, and the game is over. But white, of course, will see it. Pawn goes to b4. What you gain out of that is that the pawn is not in the original place, and the pawn a3 becomes backwards. And I decide to give more space to my rook, because my rook on the b file, if I could exchange pawns, it has an open file. So my pawn goes to a5. And white is not going to oblige, is not going to exchange my queen, my pawns, because if he takes a pawn, I don't even need to take the pawn back. Check to b2, and then either, even if the rook goes down, either way or other, I'm going to win the queen. That is why white is going to send the rook on c5. And I'm going to take the rook on f1. We will take my rook on f1, which means that now even if white takes my pawn, I'll have a check, but I'm not winning the queen. And I'm going to win the pawn on b4. White will take my rook, and I'm going to take the rook back, no other choice. But the problem I'm creating is with my pawn structure. I have triple pawns. White will make them double by taking one of my pawns. Now both sides have the same material, queen plus 5 pawns. What I didn't like at the time in my position is that I had double isolated pawns on b7 and b5. And I was really worried that if the queen would disappear, then due to the pawn structure, and also the fact that black's king is one square in front of mine, white would have the better chances. My queen goes to e7 to attack the pawn at b4. At least if I can win this pawn, then my double pawns will become passed pawns. White sends the queen to e1 to protect the pawns. My queen goes to g5 to attack the other pawn on g4. King goes to f3 to defend it. And my queen goes to e7 to attack once again the b4 pawn. At this moment, we completed the first 50 moves. The score is 0.00. It's going to be a dramatic game, where, especially with queens on the board, because queens have so many squares to go. It's very difficult to find every time which queen move is the best, if you need, of course, to make a queen move in the first place. Where your queen can be attacked, where it's safe, where it's not safe, where it attacks pawn. And sometimes even one pawn, if you win, if queens are exchanged, this pawn can become a passed pawn and promote. So really, this is a very difficult part of the game. And we spent a lot of time. I remember that unlike the first round when I lost and I had only used half an hour of my 90 minutes, this time when the game was over, I had used 85 out of my 90 minutes. So at least I have no regrets in this aspect. But let's see what's going to happen. Queen goes to c3 for white, a nice open fight with the queen. My queen goes to d7, protects both of the pawns on the b5, perhaps a check on d5, let's see. Pawn goes to e4 for white, and my queen goes to c6. What I want to do now, if possible, exchange queens so I don't have the double pawns any longer. White is not going to oblige, as you may think, even though the computer thinks that this would have been the best choice. So easy for the computer after the fact to tell you what could have done. White decides to place the queen at c5. And computer thinks a mistake and wants me to exchange queens. But myself, I was reluctant to do so, and I'll explain why. Because then I have double pawns. White has a nice pawn on c6, not yet passed, but white would have a very good position, I thought. But the computer thinks otherwise. Let's see what would happen if I would take the queen. Take, then g5, I push to g5, king goes to g2, king 7, h3, g6, and then I could win with my g and h pawns. That's what the computer thinks would happen. You see here, it would exchange pawns, and I would have one pass pawn gh. And then I would be safe from the bc pawns. That's what computer thinks, but unfortunately for me, I need to say that I didn't see it. I wanted to avoid the queen exchange, and so I sent my king to f7. So while before, it's a miss in the computer could have a big advantage. 164 is quite important. Now again in the zero category. King goes to f4 for white. Again, the computer wants me to exchange queens. And again, I'm afraid to do so because of the pawn structure. What do? Send the king back. Pawn goes to g5. I wanted by that to expand, and also the further away my pawns are placed, the better the chance for promotion if it comes down to pawn race. King goes to e3 for white. And my king goes to e8. Now, what I want to do now is have the king go near the BC place and perhaps help create a favorite climate for me, help with the pawns there. But because the e7 pawn is controlled by the white queen, I send instead the king to e8. And believe it or not, that was a mistake. You see here that if I exchange queens before, no, by now it would be still almost even, but by sending it to e8, now things become terrible. 3.89 advantage for white. At that time, I really thought I was way behind. I didn't even expect that by exchanging queens, there were at least two occasions that would have been way ahead. And white decides to do what I was expecting white to do. Edgar pushes his pawn to d5. And I know from here on things are going to be difficult. Even though at this point, now it's white that needs to exchange the queens. Take it back, and white takes it back. And my queen is attacked. What can I do? I want to give my queen a little freedom. I saw that things were started becoming difficult. So if it goes at least to a6, my queen can go to a3 check, and who knows, perhaps even from behind, be able to take some pawns. King goes to e4 for white, and my queen checks from g6. But you see, by now, white has a big advantage, 7.03, even though this was the best move. King goes to d4. Queen goes to a6 again. By now, I'm desperately hoping if there is a threefold repetition. And white is going to place the queen on c8 to check. And my king goes to e7. I see now that little by little things become very difficult. White has two connected passed pawns in c5 and d5, protected by a nice queen on c8. We completed 60 moves. And by now, why, believe it or not, white has a mate in 18 moves. As you may see, the whole game until now, assuming nothing changes, because there's still some game to be played, was decided in two mistakes I made. The first one, I made it twice. I refused to exchange the queens. While I was safe on the queen side of the board, while the g and h with the support of my king could have created danger for white. And the second is when I placed my king on e8. And not easy to spot during the game, and white played the way I expected. Pawn goes to d6 with a check, king goes to f7. 15 moves until mate. The other pawn goes to e6. King goes to g7. Queen goes to d7. My queen on a6. White can control a lot of squares without worrying about it. King goes to g8. Queen to e8, check. King to g7. Queen to f7. King to h8. And from now on, white cannot continue checking indefinitely for a mate, because what's going to happen is that there's going to be a threefold repetition. If white decides to check on the 8th rank, my king goes to h7 perhaps, and then back and forth. White needs to make a move without a check and without the queen. So what white does is move the king to e5. But that's what I was hoping for, because who knows? Because now I have a check. Queen goes to a1. Can I have a perpetual? Never know. Of course, inside me, I knew that the chances were very few, but one tries whatever one can do. King goes to f5. Now what will happen? I can win white's queen if I check from behind, but then you see what would happen. If I check from f1, that the computer does not even have among the top 3 moves, king could go to g6. And unfortunately, this pawn on h6 at your move makes sure there is no stalemate. I knew that exchanging queens would not be good for me. My only hope was with queens and perhaps a perpetual. That's why I go to b1 to check. King goes to f6, comes near to my king. Queen goes to b2. King goes to e7. No checks any longer. If it went, for example, to g6, I still had checks. Now I need to think what to do. Well, still the queen cannot check mate directly, but the king is safe. I cannot check it, but it cannot help too much in checkmating my queen for now. But later it may go to f8. Let's see what's going to happen. As does it say, die with your stomach full. So since my game was near the end, I said, let me take my opponent before. What else can I do? At least let me be ahead in material. King goes to d7. Because now what's happening is that the pawn on d6 is pinned. White cannot move the d6. Pawn cannot move the e6 because the king is in front of it. What can white do? Move the king to d7. And let me grab a second pawn on g4. And we finished the first 70 moves, believe it or not. Computer says we're 7 moves away from 8, but I have 2 extra pawns. The pawn on e6 cannot go to e7 because the pin. The pawn on d6 cannot go to d7 because the king is in front of it. Do I have a prayer? Not according to the computer, but it did not know it, of course, during the game. Said, let me do whatever is possible. King goes to d8 now. And now both pawns can go to 7th rank. And my queen goes to d4, threatening the pawn on d6. If white does nothing, I grab the pawn on d6. And of course, white does something, pawn goes to d7. If anything, after grabbing these pawns, any chance for stalemate becomes even smaller because now instead of just having the h pawn to move, I have all my 4 pawns are free to move. My queen goes to d6, trying to control as much square near my king as possible. If I didn't have these pawns, perhaps I could sacrifice the queen and have a stalemate. White decides to check me now with a queen on f6. King goes to h7. King goes to e8. Queen goes to c6. The d7 pawn is pinned and the e6 can only go until e7. I was calculating all these things, trying to delay the inevitable as much as possible. Queen goes to f7 for white. My king goes to h8, no other choice. And white king goes to f8. And you see now, if white could play, they have checkmate g7 or g8. So my only hope is a few checks, who knows. Queen goes to d6 check. Covers with the pawn, goes to e6 to e7. At least the e-pawn cannot promote because of the pin. Queen goes to b8 check. And white promotes to d8 with the queen to block the check. At this moment, I knew that if I exchanged queens, I would lose a game no matter what. I saw the diagonal from a1 to h8, that the queen could go and checkmate from g7, so I wanted to block it. And I put my queen on e5. I knew that there was no hope, but I was really caught a little bit by surprise because my opponent reminded me that it's not only g7 that you can mate, but also g8. So Edgar checkmates me. The game is over in 79 moves. Quite a long game, exciting one. Well, I had my chance, I have to say, in spite of playing with a player 300 points above me. I had my chance. If I had exchanged my queens when I had the chance. And the reason I did not exchange is because I had not enough time to go through everything, and all I could see is that not have these double pawns. But in chess, every rule has exceptions. But to find exceptions, you need to have enough energy, time, and skill to figure it out. Otherwise, you go by the general rules that apply most of the times. Edgar, congratulations for winning that game. You played very well, very hard. And let's see what does the review of chess.com have to say. 84.8% accuracy for Edgar and 20.5 for me. Our ratings 2250 for Edgar and 2050 for me, 200 point difference. Quite good, perhaps a little flattering. Above 2000 is always good to be in this category. And let's see the various departments. How did we do? No brilliant moves. Edgar had 6 great, I had 1. 29 best for Edgar, 26 for me. 15 excellent for Edgar, 16 for me. 10 good for Edgar, then 9 for me. Book moves 9 for Edgar, 8 for me. This meant that more than half of the moves of Edgar's, 44 out of 79, were either great, best, or book, compared to 35 of me. And let's go in the negative departments. Inaccuracies 4 for Edgar, 8 for me. Mistakes 6 for Edgar, 4 for me. Misses 2 for Edgar, 4 for me. And none of us had any blunders. This concludes the coverage of round 3. And after that round, I had 1 point out of 3. Losses in rounds 1 and 3, win in round 2. 2 more rounds to go. And before we conclude, I have some exciting announcements. In chess.com, we're going to have a tournament, the grecochess tournament, that is dedicated to this channel. And after I complete the last 2 videos, in fact, after I complete the next video from round 4 and before round 5, I'm going to talk more about it. For the time being, let's have a brief look at the grecochess tournament. 16 players. It just started yesterday. Until now, we already have 1 player with 2 moves. After I complete the next video with round 4, I'm going to discuss later. I'll have a special video about the grecochess tournament and how it's going. And I'm going to present the games once I conclude. But that's it for now. I am Harry Lasseniziris. This is my YouTube channel, Greco Chess. Ladies and gentlemen, goodbye.